Okay, so we're back in Tractate Menachot. This is Daf 11. So at the end of Daf 10, it says, the Mishnah teaches if a priest removed the handful of flour and a stone or a grain of salt emerged in his hand, now we're in 11, or a pinch of frankincense emerged in his hand, the meal offering is unfit, as the handful lacks a full measure on account of these items. So the Gemara asks, why do I need all these examples? Any one of them would convey the fact that the handful must contain a full measure. So the Gemara explains, all of the cases are necessary because if the Mishnah had taught only the example of a stone, it might have been thought that only a stone diminishes the measure of the handful because it is not fit for service. But with regard to salt, which is fit for sacrifice, as the priest places salt on the handful before burning it upon the altar, one might say that the handful should be fit, as salt should not subtract from the handful's measure. So, and if the Mishnah had taught only the example of salt, it might have been thought that the salt diminishes the handful's measure as it was not initially fixed together with the entire meal offering. The reason that the priest salts the handful alone. But with regard to the frankincense, which was initially fixed together with the entire meal offering, it is placed upon the meal offering before the priest removes a handful from it. So one might say that the handful should be fit, and the frankincense should not diminish from the handful's measure. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that in any of these instances, the meal offering is unfit. The Mishnah teaches that if a stone or a grain of salt or a pinch of frankincense emerged in the priest's handful together with the handful, the meal offering is unfit due to the fact that the sages said the handful that is lacking or that is outsized is fit. The handful that is lacking or that is outsized is unfit. The Gemara asks, why does the Tana explain that the offering is not valid specifically because it is lacking or outsized? But let the Tana derive that such a handful is not valid due to the fact that there is an interposition between the priest's hand and the handful. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since there are certain instances where these items do not interpose between one's hand and the handful, like when they are located on the side of the handful, the Mishnah teaches that they disqualify the handful due to the fact that they reduce its measure. Abai said to Rava, how did the priest properly remove the handful from the meal offering? Rava said to them, they remove it as people normally remove handfuls, by folding all of their fingers over the palm. And Abai raised an objection to Rava from Braita discussing the mitzvah function of each of the fingers. This small finger is for measuring a span, Exodus 28:16, the distance between the thumb and the little finger, so a span, that distance. This fourth finger is used for removal of a handful from the meal offering. So the measurement of a handful begins from this finger as the priest removes the handful, folding the middle three fingers over his palm. So they're doing this, right? So furthermore, this middle finger is used for measuring a cubit, the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. This forefinger next to the thumb is the finger used to sprinkle blood of the offerings. And finally, this thumb is the one on which the blood and the oil is placed during the purification ritual of a leper, Leviticus 14:17. Evidently, the little finger is not used in the removal of a handful. So the Gemara responds, the little finger is used only for the purposes of leveling the handful. That is to say, the priest first removes a handful with a full hand, all of his fingers, so that it should not be lacking in measure, and then wipes away the protruding flour with his little finger from the bottom, and with his thumb from the top. So they're saying that you can wipe that, so it's being held with these three fingers. The Gemara asks, how is the removal of the handful performed? So Rav Zutra bar Tovia says that Rav says when the priest places his hand in the meal offering, he bends his middle three fingers until the tips of his fingers reach over the palm of his hand, and he then removes the handful. The Gemara notes that this is also taught in a Braita from the verse that states, and he shall remove from there his handful, Leviticus 2:2. One might have thought that the handful should be overflowing. Therefore, another verse states, and he shall take up from it with his handful, or bekumtzo, Leviticus 6:8. So the prefix that means with can also mean in, so the bait, right? Indicating that the proper measure of a handful is that which is contained within one's fingers alone. So the Braita continues, if the measurement of a handful is determined by the term with his handful, One might have thought that the priest removes a handful with his fingertips. That is, that a handful consists of that which the priest removes by folding his fingers onto themselves. Therefore, the verse states his handful, indicating that the handful must be full and not merely that which is contained within his fingers. So how so? He scoops by closing his 3 fingers over the palm of his hand, and in this way takes a handful from the flour of the meal offering. The Braita continues, excuse me, in the case of a pan meal offering and that of a deep pan meal offering, when the flour was fried before being scooped and was therefore hard, the priest wipes away with his thumb any flour that was overflowing above his handful, and with his little finger he wipes away the flour that was pushing out below. And this precise taking of the handful of a meal offering is the most difficult sacrificial rite in the temple, as the priest must wipe away any protruding elements without removing any flour from the handful itself. The Gemara asks, this one is the hardest sacrificial rite and no other? But isn't there pinching the nape of the neck of a bird offering, which is also considered extremely difficult to perform? And there isn't the scooping of the handful of incense by the high priest on Yom Kippur, another rite that is extremely difficult to perform? Rather, the Braita means that this taking of the handful of a meal offering is one of the most difficult sacrificial rites in the temple. Rav Papa said, this is obvious to me that the term his handful means that the removal of the handful from a meal offering should be performed ad initio in the manner that people usually remove a handful, with their fingertips angled to the side. So Rav Papa raises a dilemma. What is the halacha if the priest removed a handful with his fingertips? That is, if he placed his hand horizontally over the meal offering and filled his palm with flour by closing his fingers to his palm. Does this disqualify the taking of the handful or not? So I think they mean like taking it like this instead of like scooping it like this. So similarly, if the priest took a handful from the sides by passing the back of his hand back and forth over the flour in the vessel so that the flour collected in his palm by way of the side of his palm, what is the halacha? Furthermore, if he took the handful with the back of his hand placed downward in the vessel, and with his fingers he collected the flour upward onto his palm, what is the halacha? Are the handfuls removed in this manner fit for sacrifice? The Gemara states these dilemmas stand unresolved. Okay, so I'm sorry. So I think the initial way was like this, and then they just talked about doing it like this, and the other way I think was like taking it like that. All right. So it's unresolved. Rav Papa said, it is obvious to me that when the Torah states his handful, Leviticus 16:12, in the context of the scooping of handfuls of incense by the high priest on Yom Kippur, it means in the manner that people usually scoop a handful, by placing the backs of their hands into the vessel and bringing their hands together. So Rav Papa raises a dilemma. What is the halacha if the high priest scooped a handful with his fingertips? What is the halacha if he took a handful from the sides? And what is the halacha if he scooped a handful with his hand, with this hand and with that hand separately and then brought them together? So the Gemara states, these dilemmas stand unresolved. So Rav Papa raises yet another dilemma. If the priest took the handful from the vessel containing the meal offering and stuck the handful onto the side of the second vessel in order to sanctify it, but the handful was not placed directly into the vessel, what is the halacha? Do we require that the handful be inside the vessel? And that is the case here. Or perhaps we require that the handful be placed properly inside the vessel, and that is not the case in this instance. So no answers found, and the Gemara concludes the dilemma shall stand unresolved. So Mar Bar Rav Ashi raises a similar dilemma. If the priest overturned the vessel and stuck the handful to the underside of the vessel, in a case where there was an indentation on the underside, what is the halacha? Do we require that the handful be placed inside the vessel? And that requirement is fulfilled here as the handful is within the indentation, or perhaps we require that it be placed properly in the vessel, and that is not the case here. The Gemara states the dilemma shall stand unresolved. Okay, so like, you know how some things like the wine bottle at the bottom, it has like so if there's something in the bottom where you could place the hand, place that, it's in the vessel because the vessel seems to have two areas where it can be inside of. So the Mishnah says, how does the priest perform the removal of a handful? He extends his fingers onto the palm of his hand, If one increased its oil, decreased its oil, or decreased its frankincense beyond the appropriate measures, the meal offering is unfit. So the Gemara says, what are the circumstances of a case where the meal offering is disqualified due to the fact that one increased its oil? So Rabbi Eliezer says the circumstances are a case where he separated 2 log of oil for the meal offering instead of 1 log, and mixed them into 1/10 of an ephah of flour. So the Gemara raises a difficulty, and let Rabbi Eliezer interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case where he mixed non-sacred oil, or the oil of another meal offering, into the meal offering. So, and if you would say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do not disqualify a meal offering, Rav Zutra bar Tovia objects to this claim. If that is so, then with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, of which it is stated in 59b that oil disqualifies it, how can you find the circumstances where it is in fact disqualified? So Rav Zutra bar Tovia elaborates, if you suggest that that he mixed its own oil into the flour, such a case does not exist, as the meal offering of a sinner does not have any oil. If he mixed non-sacred oil or that of another meal offering into the flour, the meal offering should not be disqualified, as you said that such oil does not disqualify a meal offering. And if you would say that he designated oil for his meal offering and mixed it into the flour despite the Torah prohibition against mixing oil into it, I say that since the meal offering of a sinner does not have oil at all, any oil that he separates and mixes into it is considered non-sacred, and you have already said that non-sacred oil does not disqualify a meal offering. So the Gemara responds, in fact, non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering do disqualify a meal offering, and Rabbi Eliezer is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary as follows. It is not necessary to say that non-sacred oil and the oil of another meal offering disqualify a meal offering, but in a case where one separated 2 log for his meal offering, since this first log is fit for the meal offering, the second is also fit for it, one might say that even when he mixes both log into the meal offering, it should not disqualify the meal offering. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer teaches us that the meal offering is disqualified in this case as well. The Gemara asks, and from where does Rabbi Eliezer derive this conclusion? So Rava said the terminology of the Mishnah posed a difficulty for him, as one can ask, why does the Tana specifically teach that the meal offering is disqualified if he increased its oil, which indicates that he increased it with oil belonging to the offering itself? Let the Mishnah teach simply he increased the oil. Rather, this is what the Mishnah teaches us, that even though he initially separated 2 log of oil for the meal offering, its own oil disqualifies the offering when there is too much. So the Mishnah teaches that if one decreased its frankincense beyond its appropriate measure, the meal offering is unfit. Concerning this, the sages taught in a Braita, if one decreased its frankincense to the point that the amount stood at only 1 pinch, it is disqualified, but if the decreased amount stood at 2 pinches, it is fit. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Shimon says, if the decreased amount stood at 1 pinch, it is fit. Less than that, it is disqualified. So the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Braita that Rabbi Shimon says a handful of flour or frankincense that was decreased by any amount from its full measure is disqualified? The Gemara answers that one should teach the Braita as follows. A pinch of frankincense that was decreased by any amount is disqualified. And if you wish, say instead that here the first cited statement of Rabbi Shimon is referring to the case of frankincense that comes with a meal offering, and this frankincense is disqualified only when there is less than a pinch. Whereas there, the second statement of Rabbi Shimon is referring to the case of frankincense that comes by itself. Such frankincense is disqualified if it comprises any less than its full measure. So Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says, there are 3 disputes of Tanaim with regard to the matter. Rabbi Meir holds that the priest may remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately as 2 pinches from it must be burned upon the altar. And Rabbi Shimon holds that the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately at least 1 pinch from it must be burned upon the altar. And all 3 of them interpret a single verse differently. So the verse states, this is Leviticus 6, verse 8, and he shall take up from there his handful of the fine flour of the meal offering of the oil of it, and all the frankincense, so ve'et is and all the frankincense that is upon the meal offering, and shall make it smoke upon the altar. So Rabbi Meir holds that one may not make the offering smoke upon the altar unless there remains the entire measure of frankincense that was initially fixed together with the meal offering. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that when the verse states kol or all, it is referring to any part of the frankincense, even a small pinch, as kol can mean any amount. And when the verse states et, this serves to include another pinch. Accordingly, at least 2 pinches must remain to be burned upon the altar. And Rabbi Shimon interprets the word all in the same manner as does Rabbi Yehuda, but he does not interpret and derive a halacha from the term et, and he therefore holds that only 1 pinch must be remain to be burned. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef further says that Rabbi Yochanan says the dispute between his Tanaim is with regard to frankincense. Frankincense in that... The dispute between these Tanaim is with regard to frankincense that comes with a meal offering. But with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, everyone, even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, agrees that the priest must bring a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. For this reason, it was necessary for the verse to state, "This is upon the meal offering," as this indicates that together with the meal offering, yes, one may burn the frankincense, even if there remains only a pinch or 2, but with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, one may not burn it if it is in that state. So, and Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says, the dispute between these Tanaim is with regard to frankincense that comes with a meal offering, but with regard to frankincense that comes in bowls together with the showbread, everyone, even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, agrees that there must be 2 handfuls in the beginning, 1 handful for each bowl, and ultimately there must also be 2 handfuls. So the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is the case as with regard to this halacha? The verse does not state the term all from which one might derive, or kol, or all from which one might derive that is referring to any part of the frankincense. The Gemara explains, this ruling is necessary lest you say that since the frankincense in the bowls comes together with bread, that is the showbread, it should be considered as frankincense that is upon the meal offering. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon claim that one may sacrifice it even if less than 2 handfuls remain. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef teaches us that this is not the case. The Gemara notes Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha disagree with regard to the case of frankincense that comes by itself. So one says that the dispute between the Tanaim with regard to whether or not a handful of frankincense that became lacking may be sacrificed upon the altar applies only with regard to frankincense that comes with the meal offering, but with regard to frankincense that comes by itself, everyone agrees the priest must remove a handful at the beginning, and ultimately the entire handful must be burned upon the altar. And one says, just as there is the dispute in this case, so too there is a dispute in that case. So the Mishnah teaches that if the priest decreased its frankincense beyond its appropriate measure, the meal offering is unfit. The Gemara infers from the statement that if he increased its frankincense, it is fit. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Braita that if he increased its frankincense, the meal offering is disqualified? So Rami Bar Chama said the Braita rules that the meal offering is disqualified in the case where he separated 2 handfuls of frankincense for the meal offering and placed both of them onto the meal offering. And Rami Bar Chama says in a case where one separated 2 handfuls of frankincense for the meal offering and subsequently lost one of them, if it was lost before the removal of the handful of the meal offering, the additional frankincense was not fixed with the meal offering, and therefore it does not disqualify the meal offering. But if this occurred after the removal of the handful of the meal offering, since both handfuls were already fixed with the meal offering, it is disqualified as he increased its frankincense by a large amount. And Rami Bar Chama says, in a case where one separated 4 handfuls of frankincense for placement in the 2 bowls that accompany the showbread, and 2 of them were subsequently lost, the halacha depends on when they were lost. If they were lost before the removal of the bowls from the table of the showbread, then the additional frankincense was not yet fixed with the showbread, and the frankincense remains fit for sacrifice. But if they were lost after the removal of the bowls, then all 4 handfuls were already fixed with the showbread, and therefore the frankincense is disqualified. The Gemara asks, why do I also need this? This statement of Rami Bar Chama is identical to that previous statement as the burning of the frankincense permits the showbread for consumption, just as the frankincense permits the meal offering for consumption. Consequently, the removal of bowls of frankincense is comparable to the removal of the handful from a meal offering. The Gemara explains, the last statement of Rami Bar Chama is necessary, lest you say that since the handful of frankincense of the showbread is already considered designated for burning, as it is placed in a separate bowl and burned in its entirety, then once the time arrives for removing the bowls from upon the table of the showbread, it is considered as though the bowls were already removed, and the showbread should therefore be disqualified on account of the additional frankincense. Therefore, Rami Bar Chama teaches us that the additional handfuls disqualify the showbread only if they were inside the bowls at the time of their actual removal from the table. So now we're back to a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, with regard to one who removes a handful from the meal offering with the intent to partake of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, or to partake of an olive bulk of its remainder outside the temple courtyard, to burn its handful outside the temple courtyard, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful outside, or to burn its frankincense outside. In all these cases, the offering is unfit, but there's no liability for karet for one who partakes of it. If one had the intent to partake of its remainder on the next day, or partake of an olive bulk of its remainder on the next day, to burn its handful on the next day, or to burn an olive bulk of its handful on the next day, or to burn its frankincense on the next day. And that is the end of Daf 11.